Peter noticed something moving in the distance. Reports of predators in the area meant he had to be careful. He moved closer, hoping to spot the bear he was searching for, but then something unusual caught his attention. He saw the black bear, but what shocked him was that the bear was carrying a baby. Peter's face turned pale. He had never seen anything like this before. He knew he had to make sure the baby was safe, but there was a big problem. The bear refused to let the baby go. Peter had to act cautiously. His mind raced with questions. What was the bear doing with the baby? He knew one wrong move could put the baby in serious danger. He had to get the baby to safety, but it wouldn't be easy. Peter slowly approached from behind as the bear placed the baby on the ground. This could be his only chance, but the bear suddenly turned around. But before we dive into the story, make sure to smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our exciting stories. Peter froze as the bear stared directly at him. His heart raced like never before. He knew that any sudden movement could provoke the bear. Instead of attacking, the bear picked up the baby and ran. It was too fast for Peter to track. Desperate, Peter knew he needed to get help, but when he informed his fellow rangers, no one believed him. Determined to find the baby, Peter called the police. While his fellow rangers thought he was losing his mind, the police took his story seriously. Officers arrived quickly, but something strange happened. Peter's boss spoke privately with the officers, and after that, they ignored him. Confused and frustrated, Peter demanded answers, but his boss told him to sit down and wait. The officers soon returned, claiming they had searched the area but found nothing. They began questioning Peter, doubting his story about the bear and the baby. This caused Peter to break down in frustration. He was even suspended from his job, with his colleagues assuming he was hallucinating due to recent trauma, the loss of his own baby. But Peter knew what he had seen, and he was determined to find out the truth on his own. Peter was determined to figure things out himself. Even though he was no longer allowed in the forest, he didn't care. The baby's safety was his only concern. His wife tried to stop him, but she knew it was pointless. Early the next morning, Peter snuck into the forest, knowing no one would be watching. Before heading out, Peter went to see his best friend Jacob, who was also a ranger. Jacob had heard about Peter's suspension and was surprised to see him. Peter explained everything, insisting that they needed to rescue the baby. Jacob was skeptical and didn't want to get involved. But when Peter broke down in front of him, Jacob reluctantly agreed to join him, worried that Peter might hurt himself. As they walked deeper into the forest, Peter kept rambling about the baby and the bear, which made Jacob more convinced that Peter had lost his mind. But then something changed. Jacob spotted large bear tracks in the distance. Intrigued, Jacob followed the tracks, realizing they indeed belonged to a black bear. He started to believe that Peter had at least seen the bear, but he was still unsure about the baby. With both men on the same page about the bear, they knew they had to proceed with caution. Black bears are dangerous, and if this one had a human baby, it could react unpredictably. Jacob found more tracks, but suddenly they lost the trail. Frustrated, Peter grew more desperate. Out of nowhere, a loud roar echoed through the trees, freezing both men in place. Then Peter realized they were close to the bear's territory. He began moving toward the noise, but Jacob pulled him back, terrified. He urged Peter to call for backup, but Peter refused. He felt betrayed by everyone and didn't trust anyone to help. Jacob, still fearful, wanted to turn back. Then they heard more noises. The bear was approaching. Jacob was terrified, but Peter was too focused on saving the baby to turn back. Peter convinced Jacob to stay close, reminding him that they were safer together. They had no gear to protect themselves or to sedate the bear, so one of them would need to distract it if necessary. Reluctantly, Jacob followed Peter deeper into the forest. Peter was convinced they were close. He felt adrenaline pumping through his veins, knowing the baby's life could depend on his actions. Then Jacob gasped. In the distance, they spotted a cave. Definitely no ordinary cave. The bear's tracks led straight inside. Peter knew they had found the bear's den. They carefully approached, but then Peter froze. He saw the bear just inside the cave, and his worst fears were confirmed. He wasn't going crazy. The bear was real, and so was the baby. Jacob, now fully convinced, was more terrified than ever. He tried to convince Peter to return to the ranger station for help, but Peter refused. He was determined to see this through. He needed to find the baby, and he wouldn't leave until he did. Then, from deep within the cave, they heard a sound that made Peter's heart race, the faint cry of a baby. The bear reacted to the sound and disappeared into the cave. Moments later, the crying stopped, and the bear emerged. Peter now knew for certain the baby was inside. But before he could make a move, the bear spotted Jacob. The situation turned deadly in an instant. The bear charged at Jacob, who panicked and began to run. Peter shouted for him to stay still, but it was too late. The bear was gaining on Jacob, who was running as fast as he could. In a split second, Jacob tripped. Just as the bear closed in, Jacob scrambled up a tree, barely escaping the bear's reach. The bear tried to climb the tree, but Jacob was safe for the moment. This was Peter's chance. While the bear was distracted, he had to act. He could hear Jacob yelling in the distance, but Peter felt the urgency to save the baby. He sprinted toward the cave, knowing he had only moments before the bear returned. Peter dashed into the cave, his heart pounding in his chest. It was dark, but he pulled out his phone to use as a flashlight. He moved cautiously, not knowing what he would find inside. The air was cold, and the cave felt eerie. Suddenly, he heard a soft noise from deeper within. Following the sound, Peter walked further into the cave, praying the bear wouldn't return too soon. Then, in the dim light, Peter saw what he had been searching for: the baby. The child was lying on the cave floor, seemingly unharmed. Peter rushed over, his relief overwhelming. The baby was safe for now. But Peter knew they had little time before the bear returned. Cradling the baby in his arms, Peter hurried toward the cave entrance. Just as he neared the exit, he heard a noise behind him. The bear was coming back. Peter quickly turned off his phone's light and pressed himself against the cave wall, holding the baby close. His heart raced as he listened to the bear's heavy footsteps drawing closer. Peter tried to calm the baby, but then, in the worst possible moment, the baby started crying. The bear immediately turned its attention toward them. Peter knew it had spotted them. He flicked his phone's light back on and came face to face with the massive bear. The bear stood still for a moment, eyeing Peter and the baby. Peter was trapped, backed into a corner with no way out. He held the baby tightly, bracing for the worst. But then, out of nowhere, the bear collapsed to the ground. Peter stood in shock, unsure of what had just happened. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Several rangers rushed into the cave. It turns out Jacob had called for backup just before they entered the forest. The rangers had sedated the bear just in time. Peter sighed with relief, but the mystery was far from over. The rangers safely escorted Peter and the baby out of the cave, but there were still so many questions to be answered. The bear had been tranquilized, but what about the baby? Who were its parents? And why was no one looking for it? Once outside the cave, Peter handed the baby over to the rangers, who immediately called for medical assistance. The baby seemed unharmed, but Peter insisted on staying by its side. The police arrived soon after, and the baby was rushed to the nearest hospital for a thorough checkup. Peter, exhausted but relieved, went along. At the hospital, a group of doctors quickly examined the baby. Peter refused to leave, pacing the hallway anxiously. He wanted to make sure the child was truly safe. The police also took a DNA sample from the baby in hopes of identifying its family, but so far, no reports of a missing child had surfaced. Hours passed and Peter had not slept. He kept checking in with the doctors, but there was still no news about the baby's identity. Meanwhile, he learned that the tranquilized bear had been taken back into the forest. The animal was unharmed, which brought Peter some peace, but the mystery surrounding the baby weighed heavily on his mind. Finally, after 24 sleepless hours, Peter received news. A police officer approached him and led him into an office where Peter's wife had already arrived. The officer began explaining what they had discovered. The DNA results were back, and they had uncovered something devastating. The baby's parents had been found in the forest, victims of a fatal car crash. Their car had veered off a cliff several days ago. Miraculously, the baby had survived the crash, but the parents had not. The bear, for reasons unknown, had found the baby and somehow kept it safe all this time, even feeding it. Peter was overwhelmed with emotion. The news hit him hard, but there was something else that struck him even deeper. No relatives of the baby had come forward, and it seemed the child had no close family left. Peter looked at his wife, and without saying a word, they both knew what they had to do. They couldn't let this baby grow up without a family. After everything they had been through, they decided to adopt the child as their own. Peter's life changed forever that day. He returned to his job as a ranger, but now with a new sense of purpose. He and his wife raised the child as their own, and their son eventually grew up to become a ranger, just like his father.